So I want to start off just by saying I'm a bit nervous, and what would really probably help me is if maybe we can check in. Some people can throw where they're at into the chat and just sort of see where everybody's at. Chris asks, "Does circling enable you to grow a sick beard?" Yeah, this is my third wave beard.
I'll check in. My attempt at growing a beard is pretty rubbish at the moment. Yeah, so I found out about circling through the Growth Edge network. My lovely friend Romek took us through a call where we tried it out. And yeah, that's kind of my only introduction to it. And I love it though. I've been using it in all sorts of different forums and found that it's got people down into a really intimate and very present and real conversation very quickly in different situations as well, with a very high level of trust.
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, and I just want to sort of go through the check-ins through the chat. I wish we had the time. I'd love to hear from everybody.
Sorry.
Here. Oh no worries. See, David's feeling tender. Some excitement. Some people who know others who've done it, never tried it. Yeah. No, that's great. Okay. Thanks, that's helping. Feeling curious, a bit scattered. Yeah, great. Okay. So I'm going to start my presentation here. Get the presenter view going. Just bear with me as I tab through to Zoom, share my screen. Okay. Does that look right? Okay, I got a thumbs from Peter. Perfect. Okay. So, yeah, the intention of this talk is to talk a bit about the history, go into a bit about the ecology that I think surrounds circling, and talk a bit about its potential, some that's already been realized and some that seems to be emerging. So I had written 17 pages of stuff that I thought was interesting for this in preparation, but then I tried to whittle it down into what I think might actually be interesting to others. I got it down to 57 slides, and that was painful, which I'm hoping to deliver in the next 40 to 45 minutes. So with that, I'm just aiming for broad strokes, and then I think there'll be an opportunity at the end that we can sort of deep dive into something that catches your attention through the Q&A. So a little bit about me. I was a software engineer, well, still I am, for 28 years. I competed in amateur motorsport for 11 years. My first marriage lasted 9 within a 20-year-long relationship. I have an 11-year-old daughter. I met my wife, Joanna, in 2013, which means I've been doing circling and authentic relating practice for about 8 years now. And I'm a recovering Enneagram 1 with a 2-wing and an ENTJ, for whatever that helps you get who I am. So yeah, some history. Some of this is from the horse's mouth, and I took some liberties to try to condense this, as my first go at it was about 20 minutes just on this section. So I split it up into 3 phases. The first phase I'm calling the Wild West for a reason. And I'm liking this to sort of the waking up facet, which I'll talk a little bit more about as we go through the presentation. So sometimes the dates contradict each other in the history of things, but somewhere either in 95 or 98, Guy Sengstock, he's the blonde gentleman who maybe many of you are familiar with in the photo there, and Jerry Candelaria, who's the other person, they discover something in the desert at Burning Man, and they bring that something back to their men's groups in San Francisco. And after some time, they sort of integrated this something into what's called a weekend immersion that they called the arete experience, arete being Greek for like moral virtue, I think. Meanwhile, in the late 90s, somewhere in Missouri, this character here with the funny hat, Decker, and the one to his left, Brian Bayer, are starting to get into the habit of exploring the deepest truth of the moment as they navigate conflict in this shared household that they have. And through that, they start to build community around sort of these authentic ways of being and practices. And eventually in 2003, they end up moving to California, and they meet and start working with Guy and Jerry. So I think Barratt used the term circling in the early 2000s, although I think it was being used before, but I think this is kind of the first time it was really like pushed, I guess. I don't know. This area is a little wonky, but I think as it seems that circling as a practice is co-discovered and co-explored, it sort of makes some sense that reports from this era that the teachings in circling were more sort of through osmosis and trial and error, sort of throwing things against the wall and see what stick, rather than sort of a robustly structured workshop and training program. And I think this is part of why Brian Bayer called, I think it was Brian, maybe it was Guy, that called this the Wild West days of circling. And from what I can tell, it was only until something called the Authentic Man program that started in 2004 was circling starting to be used outside of community building and leadership trainings. So AMP, the Authentic Man program, was an experiential course that attempted to sort of do this bait and switch for guys who are interested in the pickup artist community. And instead of the course teaching them how to neg women effectively, AMP used the foundations of circling and these authentic practices to help people, help the guys better relate to women, but also help them be better people at the same time. And in the AMP program, there would be what were known as AMP women. And these would be the women who would sort of volunteer to show up for the men and provide them feedback as the men would approach them, helping them get out of their heads and just giving them an authentic mirror. And some of these AMP women, Alexis Shepard, who's the one on the left there, and Shayna James, the one on the right, they developed a mirror program called AWE, which is the Authentic Woman Experience. Then in late 2000s, Guy exited the scene for a bit and Barratt shut down in 2008. And that sort of left Brian and Decker to inherit the whole of the community in San Francisco. When Guy returns, and I'm not sure when this is, I think it's 2010, he resumed some of the work that he'd started with Alexis. And they continue to refine the training, and they offer a new program called the TCLT, which is the Transformational Coaching and Leadership Training Program. But it's considered more of a course to train coaches than it is to train circling facilitators. At the same time, Decker had met this gentleman here, Robert McNaughton. And Robert at the time was, I think, working with Ken Wilber. I don't know quite what his role was, but I know that he had a relationship with Ken. And Robert took the TCLT, and then what you'll see is sort of a common experience or common pattern. He brings the tools and the practices that were used in the TCLT, and he brings them back home to share with people. And to me, that's sort of the end of the first phase of circling. This one, the second phase, I consider sort of the growth of circling. So in the 2010s, Robert's living room circling group starts to get too big. So he starts renting space in this building at Boulder Integral. And through that, community starts to form. Back in San Francisco, sort of steeped in AMP and authentic relating practices, this gentleman doing some kind of Jedi mind trick, Michael Percelli, he's tasked with building a training program called T3, which stands for Train the Trainer Training. And this is for Authentic World, which is Decker and Brian's organization at the time. And the intention of this course is to yield consistent facilitation results for circling. Later in 2011, Robert, Decker, and Brian reluctantly lean in and take over the lease at the Boulder Integral, and they rename it the Integral Center. Shortly after that, they create Alethea, which is a weekend immersion involving a lot of AR and circling practices. Meanwhile, in 2009, an engineering student from Toronto, Josh Stein, he's the guy there on the right, he attends AMP in San Francisco. And then he ends up in Boulder in 2011. He's doing a course with TCLT trainers, and Robert's there. Josh experiences his first game night in Boulder, and shortly after, he attends the first ever Alethea. And as is the pattern, Josh comes home, he starts to share the tools and practices as best he can. So he's like holding circling events, not even having been trained in circling, but doing his best with a small group. And as happens, that group grows and expands into community. So in late 2011, Authentic World's transitioning from San Francisco to the Integral Center in Boulder, and they host this online authentic community leadership training. Josh attends, so does Sarah Ness, the lady in the photo there, and others such as Jeffrey Platts, who started the Authentic DC community. They're all on this training. In late 2011, Authentically Relating Toronto was born. In 2012, Josh signs up for the T3 training course. And in 2012, Sarah starts community in Austin. And I think Authentic DC is started in 2011 or 2012 as well. So in 2013, Josh visits the Integral Center to complete his certification in circling. And there's these two English guys there, Sean Wilkinson, the one on the top, and John Thompson on the bottom. And they're staying in some room in the Integral Center in the basement. And Josh has no idea who these guys are, but he ends up doing his certification circle, and that's circling Sean. It turns out that Sean and John are these ex-elite tennis coaches who had been introduced to the practice years prior. They also took it home. They were practicing together and had just recently started to lead community in Europe, which is now known as Circling Europe. In 2013, Guy and Alexis partner, and they start the Circling Institute. And later in 2013, Sean and John, along with Guy, lead a weekend for the Authentic Community in New York. Josh attends and then subsequently convinces Sean and John they got to come to Toronto a couple months later. Meanwhile, for me, this is where I come in. In 2013, I got divorced. I met this cute girl on the right there. That's my now wife, Joanna. And although she gave me grief for this last night, I said after stalking Art for a year, she finally got up the courage to attend an event, but then she wouldn't let me come to the event. And after that single event, I remember she came back and she said she found her people, and then she committed to attend the next Alethea in North Carolina. However, her car that was going to take her there subsequently breaks down like within the next week or two with a head gasket issue. And I think this is on the 30th of June. So I decided I'm going to offer her a ride with no intention to participate in the immersion. Because I'm an ex-car guy, I'm aware that North Carolina's got this really cool driving road called the Tail of the Dragon. And I'm thinking I'm going to drop her off there, and then I'm going to go take off and drive this road. Anyhow, she says I should attend the event before I commit to participating. And I decide not to correct her and just sort of go along with it. So the next day, I'm in the park with her, and Josh and several others are there, and we're doing this weird T group thing. I actually thought it was TEA. I had no idea. But in the second half of the event, the switch turns on for me in the experience. And afterwards, we spent several hours in the park together, and it just immediately changed how we started communicating with each other. And then through the subsequent days and weeks, we start burning through our shit. Like, we're only in our relationship for about 6 weeks. And we just start peeling back the layers of how we're relating to each other, the things that we're carrying, being vulnerable. Yeah, so we're on like this rocket ship. And therefore we attend everything that we can, everything that Josh and anybody else is putting on. And because we're attending everything, there's somebody sort of in the inner circle who then smuggles us in and says, like, we need to be a part of this thing. So in 2014, Sean and John come to Toronto, and it's here that I meet Sarah Ness and Jordan Allen. Jordan is not in those pictures, but I think he's in another picture. Sarah's up there in the far right at the top next to John. Josh starts to build a foundational training in circling for people in art. Joanna and I take it. I'm the first to certify, and Joanna is the third. Then in the fall, Michael Percelli and the Integral Center put on the Circling Summit, the one and only of its kind. And it's this grand attempt to bring the worldwide circling community together, and pretty much everybody ends up going there. It's here I first meet Alanya Forsberg, who's starting to work with Sean and John in Europe. I see Sean get circled, which ends up being important for me later on. I see the community poke fun of itself with a skit called Shit Circlers Say, which was quite humorous and maybe still on YouTube. And I watch hordes of people flock to see Guy circle whenever they get a chance to, because for a lot of people, this is their first introduction to Guy in Boulder. In 2014 and to 2016, after the intensity of that summit and the second immersion of Circling Europe, I consider for the first time in my life my purpose, and it scares me. Can say so much more about that. In 2015, Josh indicates his intention. He's going to leave Toronto. He met a girl, and he offers us to take over art, which we decide to do a couple months later. From there, Joanna and I start to expand art scope, and we develop a foundational circling training, as well as a series of 6-week intimate and committed circling group offerings that we call Core Circle. We partner with a local bioenergetics practitioner, and we put together a weekend immersion called Feel Connect Expand. And that's a photo from our first immersion there. In the fall of 2016, the Integral Center holds what they call the Relational Leadership Summit. And that's where I meet Rob McNamara. And I also sit in on Robbie Carlton's talk called 7 Things Circling Gets Wrong. And after that, I notice it starts to shift some of my unconscious habits in circling facilitation. Weeks later, I visit Berkeley and I see Guy successfully circle someone by basically just paraphrasing, meaning he just basically says back what he heard the person say. And it just kind of blows my mind just using that tool, how he could make the connection that was made in that circle, which was pretty cool. In late 2016, back in Toronto, this guy named Peter Lindbergh shows up for some circling drop-ins. In early 2017, Peter attends our second ever Core Circle series. And it's in 2017 that I attend Avalon and I get my first training in surrendered leadership, which they now call surrendered unity leadership, likely to create a distinction between Circling Europe's brand of surrendered leadership. I have a number of transrational third-tier experiences there, and I released decades of held trauma. I attempt to bring some of the practices from Avalon to a small inner group of longtime art members with the intention to help grow leadership at art. And Joanna and I develop our own leadership training called Master Circle. So again, you can sort of see this pattern here, like we get these tools, we build trainings, we build community. In the fall, I continue my training in surrendered leadership and attend Avalon again, this time with Joanna. And those 2 photos are from Avalon. I started a process to bring Avalon to Toronto for the art community. However, I have to cancel it because when we come back the second time, I learned that my father's got cancer again. So my father passes in February of 2018. And it really isn't until August that I recover from the months of trying to hold on my paying job, growing art. We end up with an emergency move, and there's just dozens of hospital and specialist appointments with my father. And then of course, his terminal diagnosis. However, the reason I mention all this is because I'm so grateful for the capacities that I learned through authentic relating and circling to really help me navigate that time. I feel that they really helped me be there for my father as best that I could. And it made it easier for me to accept what was and finding closure with him. Peter in 2018 invites me to introduce AR practices to his pre-STOA group at the U of T. And then later in the fall, he invites me to introduce circling to the same group, which he mentioned earlier. He invites John there, whom I get a chance to circle. And shortly after this, that John mentioned circling and the Cohering the Integral We Space book during one of his Awakening series lectures. Early in that year, Peter floats the idea that he mentioned earlier about this rockstar private circling group with myself, Peter, Joanna, Lubomir, Daniel, Seishin, and John. At the same time, Rebel Wisdom is now starting to talk about circling. And John Vervaeke and Guy are frequently talking and posting on YouTube. So it occurs to me that circling is now being talked about publicly and what seems to be for the first time outside of the context of authentic community, which leads me to consider the third phase of what's emerging. And this one's a young one. So I don't know if we're just cleaning up or if we're showing up or if we're doing them both at the same time here. But what happens for me is while there's all this discussion around collective intelligence in the sense-making sphere, I'm about to start this facilitation course with Josh because the course leader is Diane Musho-Hamilton, who I'm pretty sure Peter's had on the STOA, and Rob McNamara. And, you know, I'm looking up to these guys as expert facilitators, masterful facilitators. So it's like, what can they teach me? So during a prerequisite weekend, I dive deep into my displeasure with how that weekend went, especially during a staged conversation that touches on the culture war. However, I come out of it with a salient awareness of what circling does good and where it falls short. And that experience, along with what's coming through YouTube in the sense-making scene with Rebel Wisdom and Vervaeke and Hall and Wheel and Schmachtenberger, all sort of talking about what's happening in this area, it leads me to start this project to develop a modality that can manage all three perspectives, the I, the we, and the it, in dialogue. And the idea of this is in service of bridging the gap between sides and polarized topics. At the same time, I'm sort of ready to stand for my responsibility and how circling shows up in the world. And I develop a workshop on shadow work for art, and I start to prepare a new year-long comprehensive leadership training and a restructuring for art. At this time, I think John Thompson, Circling Europe, starts experimenting with Rebel Wisdom and circling as well. In January 2020, I'm in Europe for the month. There, Josh and I attend the first week of the Integral Facilitator certification training. And after that, a week-long intensive with Circling Europe via their SAS Pro, which is like an advanced circling training. Now, at this time, it occurs to me that how the SAS Pro is being advertised, that Circling Europe is aligned with the shifts I'm preparing back home for art in terms of ethics and maturation of how circling is being taught and practiced. I actually have this nice aletheia moment. We call them aletheia moments because it's the idea is it's the revealing of something that was concealed. So it's sort of like this, whoa, or aha, wow, yeah, that's always been true, but I'm just now being aware of it. So I have this nice moment during one of the sessions, because Sean is presenting some work he's done on what he calls connection intelligence. And this is based on his recent training in the neuroaffective relational model, also known as NARM, and where that model shows up in a circling relational context. And it's this moment when I discover that I, in general, don't know what I want most of the time. And once that landed for me, I noticed all my resentments of that week and the week prior at the IF with how people were showing up in the intersubjective space just dropped. They were gone. It's like my understanding of myself evolved here, and so did my facilitation and circling. 2020, 2021, the pandemic's looming. I'm executing experiences to workshop that modality. John proposes take circling and drop a problem into it. This idea comes back into our private circling group, and we experiment on it in the last session before the lockdown starts. Art cancels its new circling training, unfortunately, and we regress into community support and put a stall on our evolution. And lockdown happens, the stoa is born, Dialogos experiments start to arrive. John and I talk about my project, and out of that I branch off and develop, with some support from Josh, the Collective Intelligence Campfire project. We execute several of these in the first phase, and Guy, myself, and many others are invited to contribute to John and Chris Mastropietro's Inner and Outer Dialogues book. 2021, I mean, here we are, still in the pandemic. Guy continues to, as it seems to me, explore with where circling and Dialogos come together. The stoa maybe ends and maybe rises again within a day. And for me, inspired by Peter's Four Attractors, that's part of why I'm here today. And also I noticed a few days ago, John at Circling Europe was holding a collective intelligence experiment as well. So it seems to me that many of us, Guy and myself and John, were sort of looking forward, sort of looking to the emergence of what circling might grow into or what it's being used for. Okay, so that's the history. Probably should talk a bit about what circling actually is. So on the surface, circling is actually really basic. I'll work on it to define it on 3 levels. So it's simply an intersubjective meditation practice. However, there's many such practices. So what starts to make it unique is that circling has the basic intention or the goal to practice stepping into someone's world right here, right now. Now, how we usually do that is we usually sit, and often in a circle, and we focus our attention on someone. And while we're doing that, we're inquiring and listening within and without through questions, expressions, energy, and sometimes movement. And we repeat. So I'm going to invite you to do a little experiment here that we can do by ourselves. I invite you to sort of take a look at the palm of your hand and bring your focus to it. There's a little circling experience. And soften your gaze, looking at your hand. And just start to notice things about your own hand. Maybe you start to notice the lines. Maybe you notice some of the veins and some of the texture that's there. Maybe you're noticing how the light bounces off. Maybe you're noticing things about your hand you've never noticed before. So yeah, you can put your hand down. But it's this idea that with circling, we sort of bring exquisite attention. And through bringing exquisite attention, things start to reveal themselves that we would not catch otherwise. So it sort of brings me to the tone of circling, what I sort of refer to as what the guiding principles are, or the map that we're using in this practice. So I'm going to talk about how it is for art circling, the circling we do at art. It's going to be, there's different principles for circling Europe. I'm not sure if Guy's Circling Institute uses principles. I think they might have a slightly different framework. So I'm just going to speak for ours and what sort of makes up circling as far as art is concerned. So our first principle is to assume nothing. So to assume nothing, we first have to drop our assumptions. And this can be practiced to the extent where we start to question the words and what words and language might mean to somebody. So if somebody says that they feel happy, we don't just take in how we interpret or how we experience happy. We'll actually try to explore for them, what's happy for them? What does happy mean for them? Another way of looking at this, although it's a bit of an extreme, is can we approach the person that we have our attention on, the circlee, as if they're an alien? Let's not even assume yet that they're human. Let's actually inquire and see, as if we could try them on like a suit. How might they experience? What might they see through their eyes? How are they hearing things? So that's the first principle. The second one is to focus on presence and have attention on emergence. So what we're cognitively talking about here is getting shared reality, but what's actually happening right now in the space between us or in the we space. We also want to include somatic awareness. And simply put, it's this idea, well, it's not even an idea, the reality that the body has multiple intelligences. So for example, if fetus doesn't cognitively know to choose to breathe amniotic fluid, it just does it. Flinching is not something we choose to do, it's automatic. So here we're really starting to bring trust into the body and how the body's reacting as more information for our meditation and circling. Excuse me. We want to practice ownership and transparency. And in art, we sort of do it on two planes. The first one, as I understand, is more common, a practice of ownership to the integral tradition of circling, which is to speak in words that cannot be reasonably debated. So we're using ownership language. The other plane that we work on this is, I think, more common to circling Europe, and that's more transparency or congruent expression. So meaning that our outward expression more accurately reflects our inner experience is what we're going for here. We want to keep it relational. We see relationality as a core component that helps distinguish circling from therapy. Bringing this forward allows us to sort of address some power dynamics that are there and allows the circlee to be more impacted by the facilitator. In many styles of circling, facilitators are often encouraged to bring more of themselves into the role. Well, not even into the role, more into their facilitation, less showing up in a role. And this is in service of keeping the practice relational. And then the last is active inquiry. Active inquiry can involve something we might already be naturally curious about in the circlee. It might be something we're curious about in ourselves. Or it could be taken to the extent of being curious about why it is that I'm not curious right now. So those are sort of our guiding principles that help set the tone for how we engage in the practice. So I want to highlight this caveat about this kind of practice, especially in circling where the facilitator is asked more to bring themselves into their facilitation. So I'm calling this the art form caveat. And I think it starts to highlight distinctions and variances that you'll see in circling schools, in circling facilitators, as well as circling experiences. So on the surface, circling is really deceptively simple. We have a basic facilitation move. We set context. We try to stick to the context. And if we need to, we'll reset the context. Like that's it. We're setting up the container. However, in setting up the boundaries for it, we have virtually unlimited potential within it, and we can sort of play full out. So in many ways, this setting up of the container can create the safe space, but within that, we can play full out. So maybe this is something that Guy would appreciate, as he's often talking about asanas. So if we look at this idea of the asana, there's the posture, and then there's one's connection to the posture. So it's easy to teach the former and a little bit harder to teach the latter. It's like the quality of connection here seems in many ways to determine how close to the essence of the attention you are in your practice. In other words, there's studies in weightlifting that show that if you train the mind-muscle connection, you will get maximum gains. But if you're just sitting there lifting weights, you don't gain as much muscle. So that's just on the facilitation. Then we can zoom out and see that there's other factors. There's the context for the event in which circling is being used. So some people use circling to train leadership. Some people use circling in a coaching context. Some will use it as just to practice the practice context, and that's going to impact a bit of how we experience it. Outside of that, there's going to be the context of the organization that's using circling as a tool. Are they a circling organization? Is it just a casual thing? Are they using it for restorative justice? Like, where are they using it? And then within that organization, there's going to be a culture that gets formed that reciprocally informs how the tool is being used. So hopefully that sort of sets that up a bit. So here we've got the foundation that we can sort of teach, which is our principles and our attention. But the question is, what's going to sit on that foundation? Is it going to be a house of straw, a house of sticks, or is it going to be a house of brick with double pane glass windows and PEX plumbing? So this is all to sort of set up this perspective that I have that, sort of from that caveat and the nature of the practice and how we hold and set it up, there's a reason why circling trainings are somewhere between 6 to 12 months long. And in some cases, even longer than that. And it's in those trainings where we start to bring in supportive frames that help build our capacities so that we can build a more robust structure on top of that foundation. So therefore, I see that doing circling well means it's sort of made up a lot of sub-practices. There's a lot of influences and maps that we're using. And in that, I sort of see that it means that circling is an ecology unto itself. So the influences that we use at ART, and I know a number of other organizations also use some of these as well. We talk about and teach and practice nonviolent communication. There's the book called Getting Real by Dr. Susan Campbell, who's kind of considered the grandmother of authentic relating. We talk about integral theory and produce it. So the AQUAL map, all quadrants, all lines, as well as a lot of developmental theory. We very specifically focus on the paradoxical theory of change, which comes out of Gestalt therapy. And it's quoted there in the bottom, but I'm not going to read it. But the gist of it is that if we're going into a circle and facilitating with the intention to change somebody, they're going to dig their heels in. It's only through fully welcoming them as they are, allowing them to welcome themselves as they are, is meaningful change possible. And we've seen that time and again. I've seen that time and again in circling. We actually talk a bit about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is like linguistic relativity. And quite often we bring in elements of internal family systems therapy, the idea that there are parts, we are made up of a bunch of parts, and some parts protect other parts. And we sort of use this as a frame of noticing how it is that we're showing up. I know other schools have these other influences. Obviously, there's the Stoics. If you've ever heard Guy talk about anything, I'm sure you've heard him mention Heidegger. I know David Data is an influence for a number of people, especially considering how many dating coaches and the whole AMP thing was there. There's the book I and Thou by Martin Buber. There's the Mandala of Being, another book by Richard Moss. And Decker, I think was trained or maybe just a really big fan of Aikido. And I think he's, in his teaching and sort of transmission of circling, he was very much using sort of this neat thing about Aikido in that, not only is it a martial art that sort of protects you from the attacker, but it actually can sort of transmute that protection so that your attacker is also unharmed, which I think is a really interesting and really gets to the essence, I think, of circling in many ways. And there's tons of other influences that are out there. But I think actually the influence that's probably the biggest, or at least is for me and clearly a number of others, is integral theory. You've got Robert McNaughton, who's part of Boulder Integral. He's working with Ken Wilber. Then him, Brian, and Decker formed the Integral Center. You've got Sean and John, who I'm not sure if they were actual integral tennis coaches, but my understanding is that the way that they were teaching tennis was multi-perspectival, and they were really looking at the whole system to help their clients compete at an elite level. You've got Jordan Miska Allen, who is from Austin Integral, way back. He wrote a book called The Beautiful Apocalypse, which is a zombie story that actually integrates integral theory into it. And he's also the ex-CEO of Circling Europe, which is Sean and John above there. You've got Alanya Forsberg, who's the founder of Avalon. She's a co-author of an integral book. And she also has experience training the Norwegian Army in integral leadership development. And then you've also got the Cohering the Integral We Space book, which is about a dozen or so contributors. It's an anthology of people who are familiar with integral, but also familiar with We Space practices. So not only do you actually have circling represented in there, Sean and John, I think, maybe one of them wrote the last chapter in the book, which actually has an anecdote that happened at the end of their immersion when they first visited Toronto. But you have these other practices, these other We Space practices that start to sound very, very familiar to circling. My introduction to integral, for me, I was just happy having the experience of circling. Even though I have a big tech background, it would sort of make sense that I would want to get into, the theory, but I just didn't. I wasn't interested. But it was always being talked about. People were always referencing it. So I ended up sticking it in my to-do list, but I put it way at the bottom. And then Jordan put out his book, and I was just interested in it because I knew the guy. So I'm like, oh, I'm to support him and read his book. And while I was doing that, somebody sent me a pre-release version of Wilber's Trump in a Post-Truth World, his small book. And reading those two things sort of started to really grease the wheels for me and start to really see how integral could be useful for me in my circling facilitation. It really started to fill in some of the gaps. It started to give sense where I was not even paying attention to sense. It's started to build this robust structure, really building on the foundation that I already had. And then through attending Avalon, where they spend the first day just setting up the week, going through integral theory, spiral dynamics, and talking about Peso's theory. And then doing the week there with holding that frame in mind really helped that start to land and click. And then sort of my expanded learning was through reading Ken Wilber's Religion of Tomorrow book. So circling sort of occurs to me as an integral stage practice, which is the first stage in the second tier for that map, if you're familiar with it. So here we've got a practice where the key intention is to extend regard, which means to open ourselves up to other perspectives, to honor that the circle's perspective is real and valid for them, and to see what it's like to be with them in that reality. In short, it also seems that the practice can meet people wherever they're at on the developmental ladder, which is something you can really only do if you have an integral practice or stage of consciousness. However, going back to the caveat I mentioned before, I'm sort of more and more believing that effective facilitation requires that it be done at an integral or higher stage. And then why I'm saying that is that, you know, going back to the Pesos theories, we have to pick up our Pesos, and you might not really know what that is, but the short of it is that we're working towards an integrated wholeness. I'm seeing my thing flash. I don't know why it's flashing. Oh, it's just something in the chat. Hang on a second. I don't know if I need to see that or not. I can't find my window. Oh, there it is. Okay. Okay. Where was I? Yeah. So the theory of picking up pesos comes from Wilber. Like I said, it's used as in Avalon as a framework. But we're really working towards this integrated wholeness. So at ART, what we've done is we hold everything up that we do up to this light at the proposal through this white paper that's on the screen, which is Toward a Deliberately Developmental Civilization, which is from Ken Wilber and Dustin DePerna. And what that paper argues for is wholeness involves integrating states of consciousness. So that's like circling, meditation, with structures of consciousness, which would be like integral or psychology, with integration of the shadow. And I sort of see these things as legs on a three-legged stool. And if any of these capacities are weak, the stool's not stable and it really can't hold much weight. I want to say a couple things about spirituality and how it connects to circling. It's said that enlightenment happens by accident and practice makes us accident prone. Circling practice thus makes us accident prone. Many people consider it a fourth or fifth order consciousness from the Keegan model, that it's self-authoring or self-transformational. And personally for me, I moved from hating everyone prior to circling, very misanthropic, to realizing I possess the capacity to love just about anyone, which seems like a bit of a transformation. I know Decker has an anecdote about a friend that says if you hate somebody, it's probably because you just don't know them well enough. And I think that circling gives us an opportunity to know others and ourselves enough, and it gives us access to our true self. It also gives us access to unstructured, unplanned transrational state shifts. This isn't, it's consistent in my experience. It's not something that it sets out to do, but it definitely happens. And it offers us deeper access to reality, or to what Wilber would call the great painting of all that is. I want to talk a little bit about what I think circling does well and what it doesn't do well. I think fairly consistently, it helps people feel understood or accepted. It offers a reclamation of sovereignty, personal agency, and dignity that we might have given up. Often provides a felt sense that we're not alone, nor are we all that different, if at all. I think it gives us contact with our innate being. And we have those aletheia moments, that discovery or revealing of something that was always there, but until that moment had been concealed. Some things I think circling doesn't do well, and it's not necessarily always the fault of circling, but the way in which it tends to be practiced. There's a hyper focus on relationship, usually at the expense of context. There is a prioritization on emotions or feeling, often with a demonization of thoughts. So it's low on the third person. It doesn't work well when people are lying. There's a risk of gaslighting or reaffirming bullshit. It can prop up our narcissist or those with narcissistic tendencies. And there's usually an over-focus or privileging of pain or negative experiences. There can be a preciousness that some people bring to it, you know, the lowering of the voice, sort of the holding of the circling in this real gentle way. This privileging of negative experiences over, say, joyful or celebratory experiences. Some people can engage with it as a therapeutic bypass. So instead of getting therapy, they try to get their therapy through circling, and that's not circling's intention. And this can just lead to often a lot of navel gazing. So this is the last part here. I want to talk about how I see circling's role in the meaning crisis, the crisis of competency, and the culture wars. See if I can make a bit of a case for where I see it slotting in. So in terms of the meaning crisis, I see that religion offered a shared contextual framework for optimal being. And as a result, it fostered community and belonging. And this coherence and shared intention provide participants with a deep sense of rightness, significance, or meaning. Most of the great traditions are very high in exploring these states of consciousness, and they provided a dogma or a doctrine that was well in service of avoiding a life of evil. But for most, the structure part was rather a wobbly leg. And for some, your sovereignty wasn't quite so inherent in your humanity, but more something you earned, which is to say that there was and still is some shadow there. As such, over the years, engagement in the great traditions has waned as religions have failed to catch up to the demands of rational, world-centric, and post-conventional life. However, we can see through Ken Wilber's Religion of Tomorrow or John Vervaeke's exploration on the religion that's not a religion, an emergent structure for what's next. We can see the importance of combining states and structures of consciousness without the shadow of the stage of development those doctrines were created in or have been slow to evolve from. As we extrapolate that three-legged stool of wholeness into the four facets of wake up, grow up, clean up, and show up, we can see that expanded map for being. And I believe that circling provides a practice to engage in each one of those stages. But not only that, it flips the seeking from out there to in here. And through reality testing and introspection and through meditation on state shifts and the practice of personal agency, I think it starts to provide us with an opportunity to access source or God within. This contact can provide us with that deep sense of rightness, significance, and meaning that the great traditions were so popular for. On the crisis of competency, my sense is that we've moved into an overemphasis on what's known as feminine compassion. There's a lot of caretaking, and as we've tilted that, there's less challenge available in our world. And I see this as sort of lowering resilience, and therefore there's not many opportunities in society for anti-fragility training. So I'm sort of seeing this, that the power of context of circling and bringing in that challenge right on sort of our edge of comfort or our window of tolerance, and continuing to engage in that practice sort of gives us more capacity. It starts to expand that window. So from there, I think not only are we willing to start taking more risks, but we'll also come into contact with something within us where we actually need to take the risks. And I think this better sets us up to manage and thrive within the chaos of the world and start to show up more fully. On the culture war side of things, the way I see it is hypocrisy of the behavior on both sides further emphasizes that problems cannot be solved at the same stage that created them. Excuse me, that's an Albert Einstein quote. Therefore, I see that circling can provide the developmental lubricant to move us through to the next stage through cleaning up and showing up. I think this puts us in a great position to still the culture. And the innate humility that's present in circling practice, I think, offers us that ability to take perspective. And once we integrate that capacity, it allows us to start accessing our self-transformational capacities. And from there, we can start to see the dialectic between systems and choose the right approach for the right problem. So, am I giving circling too much credit here? Maybe it's starting to sound like some sort of magical cure-all. After all, circling is simply a set of principles used to help or be with someone else in their world in the present moment. And yet I've seen time and again in front of me with my own eyes, people wake up, grow up, clean up, and show up using this tool. I don't think it's a coincidence that when many discuss relational practices, most tend to mention circling either along with another practice or entirely on its own. I think that speaks to something about the potency of what's there for the people who experience it. And one of the things that's difficult with authentic relating and circling is to try to describe it in a way that any random person will get it from the description. And here we are, I don't even know how many minutes later, probably more than I planned. And if you haven't experienced it, there's chances are you still might not be sure what it is. And so this is often why we say it's something that needs to be experienced. And I'll close here sort of with a quote that somebody from our community offered when I asked if there was anything that I could share in this presentation that would have helped them want to try it earlier or help them sort of get what circling was, like if there were words that I could have used. And her response was, I don't think I would have believed or understood what was being said to me if someone were to tell me how circling would impact me. But I understood to whatever degree once experiencing it. So yeah, so with that, I'm hoping you want to come experience it on, I think, the 3rd when we do the practice session here at the Stoa. That is it. Thank you, everyone. Find it. There we go.
Awesome. Yeah, I will double click. Talking about circling is one thing, experiencing is another. And so we have a session on May 3rd at 6 p.m. Eastern time. So I will get to the Q&A and the questions in the chat in a moment. I'll have a question for Taylor myself, just to reflect a little bit on my end. Awesome presentation. It's like, it's a lot of appreciation for not only sort of like the collective history and what it actually is, but also slicing your personal narrative in it. Like, I really felt it. So like when I presented this idea to you to come on to Stoa, do a thing, like everything I hope for and more. So like chef kiss presentation. So thank you, Taylor. And it was interesting. I'll just share some more reflections before I ask my question. Like you mentioning these people like Guy Sangstock, Sarah Ness, John Thompson, Langia, they all came to the Stoa before, but I didn't know they were like intertwined. They're like their history. And I really felt not only like kind of like cognitively grokked what circling is, the history, but I really felt the history and like putting me in it too. Like my involvement in introducing Guy Sangstock and John Vervaeke, introducing you and John Vervaeke, and kind of like putting circling on a different map or different like meta awareness. And Jordan Peterson, my former therapist, might be coming to the Stoa soon. So his whole audience might be, getting into circling soon as well. So I don't know what's happening, but it's fucking delicious. So regarding my first question is sort of like mimetic tribes. The cool thing about circling, and you mentioned the pickup artists too. This is another thing. Like I used to be in the pickup artist scene. I was aware of AMP. I just thought these were these weird guys, but they're sort of the guys that brought an inner game in the whole pickup artist scene. So it's another cool intersection. So with mimetic tribes, circling is sort of embedded itself with like the integral theory community, the applied rationalist community. There's circling at monastic academies, so like kind of like the secular Buddhistic scene in Western Buddhism is engaged in it. It's kind of everywhere. And the cool thing about the Stoa is like one of the second attractors that you mentioned is like the culture war to culture dance. And we're sort of at the intersection of all these intersubjective practices. We have collective presencing, we have the glass bead game, we have social meditation coming up, all this kind of cool stuff. But one thing about, even though they're really awesome, all those ones, and collective presencing is really like, I would call it the heartbeat of the Stoa, but there's something about circling as a modality that just spreads. Maybe it's like how it's nebulously held, or there's a mystery behind it, or like what is circling, but it just spreads. So I was wondering if you could speak to that, and why do you think that is the case?
Yeah. It's like, do I dare try to offer a hypothesis, or do I pull a guy and just sort of ask another question? I think for me, it really just comes down to, I wasn't looking for this. I was not looking for authentic relating. Like my anecdote with me, with my wife was, she just wanted to do this thing, and I was just committed to being open to new experiences. And I went into that first practice event, and I had like no idea what was going on. Like, what's this weird guy over here, and why are we talking in this convoluted way? But there was just this thing that happened for me in that moment when somebody shared, that's the story of my life. And as he said that, the light bulb switched, and I noticed I felt something, which is a big deal for me. Like, I'm like big time software developer programmer. I'm very logical, compartmentalize all my feelings, no real self-awareness. But this idea that I can like listen to this person and they can share something about their experience, and that impacts me. And now I have my attention on how it impacts me. There's just something about that dance, that flow of the intersubjectivity, sort of creating that covenant, I think, that John talks about. It's this covenant of mutual disclosure. And something about that just occurs to me as, I don't want to use the word magical, but it feels right. It feels like it just feels right. It like lands. It lands for me as a yes. I don't know what else to say beyond that, other than to really draw that contrast of where I was and who I was, not liking people, sort of fearing them. Everybody's a threat, to like, oh, I feel things and you feel things, and we can really talk about what's really here right now and burn through all our crap and talk about the truth. And it just opened up. It just breaks through the ground in such a way. And it's like, I started to see the matrix. Like, it's, like there's the life I was living, and then I can start to see the fuzzy letters, and then through more practice I can start to see the code that's making it up. So yeah, I don't know what else to say, but I was just a big yes to it, and I'm imagining in some ways that's what happens for other people as well.
Yeah, and I noticed my engagement with it, especially after the training that I did in Toronto. Sort of, I felt like I got a superpower in communicative skills, and I just avoid debates now. Like, this is so, just speaking to what is most alive is usually not on the propositional in a conversation. Mm-hmm. And it usually just sort of stops the debate energy right away. So let's pivot to the Q&A. And Doug, you had a good question, so I'll take you in first. And we might not get to all the questions, and we're here for another 30 minutes.
Yeah, we've been running circling in our community for about 2.5 years, and our initial experiences were we were pretty open. And Ellie got trained as a facilitator down in Boulder with the people there. But we found, and this actually was reflected in my life coaching practice, where I got people coming in for life coaching, and wounds from circling would show up, and we'd have to address them. Mm-hmm. And what we found in our own community as well was that, and I framed it, in the question, that it seems like if people are coming in, ideally they come in with a postmodern, green consciousness, and they're able to hear others and encourage and actually get a second person perspective. But if they're lower than that, modern you can kind of get away with, but traditional, blue and red, they don't actually have the capacity to hear something without making it all about them. And they can hijack the expression and then say things without any sensitivity to how it's going to land on the being that's open and vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And so there was damage done. And so we had to put in safety protocols and filters to keep that from happening. And I'm curious as to if you're just lucky enough to have high level people showing up at your groups, or how do you handle those dynamics? And do you ever ask people not to come back to groups and things like that? Because developmentally they may just not be capable of circling at the level you want to be circling at.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a critical thing to look at. We have only had to ask one person not to come, and it's not because of anything that happened in an event. We've had some people leave who would start a course, and they're just like, nope, this is too much for me, I'm out. That certainly happened. But I think what we really try to do is we try to integrate what's happening in the circle into it. And sometimes that might just be a factor of having like how powerful your facilitation and your leadership is, that you can actually pause somebody and actually get them to sort of pause while you weave in what's happening in the circle. And I think that takes a lot of practice to do. I don't think it's a mistake that the art of circling training to be a facilitator, my understanding, is a 2-year-long training. And this is sort of that piece that I'm trying to bring in about how much is required. We can teach the practice and the fundamentals of it, but how much is required of us as individuals? Like, what are we coming in with as a facilitator, such that we can sort of notice that? Now, that said, I mean, we cannot control everything that's happening in the circle, and somebody can sort of come into that place. I notice that it happens a little bit less from participants. I think if somebody is the circlee, I feel like the practice can meet them down into their red or down into their blue. However, if you can sort of have a question that's being asked from the outside, to a circlee who is maybe a bit more open, that can happen. And I would say that it hasn't happened all that often, but it does happen. And there's sort of that ethical question about, well, how responsible are we for this? Sort of in that idea that we want people to be able to take this out into the real world. Like, ideally, we want people to integrate this practice into a way of being. And I think the idea of protecting everybody from a negative moment starts to become really tricky, and it starts to be this sort of decision between this idea of safety. Like, where do we draw the line in setting up the container about what is safe and what isn't? And it seems to me the best we can sort of do is train facilitators as best that we can. And, at ART, we run through a supervision process. So when people are newly certified and they're hosting events, we actually go through almost like a supervision process to check in on them and to sort of support their development, like with moments that they have that were really tricky or that they struggled through. So yeah, I mean, I'm certainly aware that this can happen. And, there's just, it's a bit of it is a point. It's a tricky thing to sort of manage, of how much feminine compassion do we hold in the space? How much do we allow for masculine compassion to be in the space? And, what is our capacity to weave in the conflict or what's happening? So, I've been in circles where as soon as we start the circlee is crying. Like, just the exquisite attention of a group on that person cracks something open in them that they probably weren't even knew that was there. So then it's like, okay, from facilitation, what do we notice, and what do we trust in ourselves? How do we sort of, do we slow everybody down? Somebody will come in like, hey, what's happening for you? We're like, well, hang on a sec, let's just slow this thing down. So I think that's that thing. It's a thing that's really hard to teach, in my opinion, unless you've got 2 years, and then you can sort of bring in all sorts of experiences and start to sort of challenge people and build these sort of anti-fragile sort of practices. But yeah, I mean, I think that is sort of the core piece, the core challenge in circling.
So I'll just cap what I think I heard you say, which is basically you're saying if you've got a skilled enough facilitator who can weave the moment into more of an objective space so that it can be processed, that can be a buffer and stop that kind of dynamic from happening. And that if a person's got enough fortitude and anti-fragility capacity, that they're not going to be wounded in the same way. And I think the part that I'd like to maybe get a little more pointed is that some people really are bulls in china shops, and you can't put enough safety latches out to keep everything from being hurt. We've bumped into that. So someone's really open and crying, and they say, well, you're just an insensitive, crybaby, and no one would ever want to be around you, or something. Like they literally make that kind of impression in that person that's really hard to undo afterwards.
Mm.
So maybe you've never come across that, but it does seem like some people just aren't developmentally ready, and they didn't even know what they were saying wasn't appropriate. Right. So what would you do in that case if you get somebody with that kind of insensitivity and lack of, you know?
Yeah, I mean, to try to bring a short answer to that, I think what I would do in that case is I would actually check in with the circling and how they were impacted by what was said. And if I felt like they weren't in a place to take care of themselves as a facilitator, I would probably come in and either work with that person who said that thing, or just pause them in a very, you know, not aggressive, but in a very forceful way. And then try to bring out more of the impact so that that person can hear that. And it may not land for that person, it may not, but at least if I can pause them, if they aren't listening to sort of directions and, you know, somebody's setting up a boundary and they're pushing the boundary again, they're setting the boundary. And yeah, at some point, you know, we got to stop and say, okay, hang on a sec. Like we're not doing this thing anymore. But fortunately that hasn't happened. But yeah, I mean, it would definitely bring my attention to the impact on the circling. That's the way that I would handle that, and try to weave it in. So hopefully they both get something out of it.
I'll jump in here. And I'd like to ask you a question in a moment, Doug. Yeah, sort of, I think one of my criticisms of circling is people who get like seduced by it, they view it as a panacea. And this is why I suggested to you, Taylor, to have like this sense-making circling supergroup with John Vervaeke, Yasna, people who have like really good sovereignty already. Because when I was going to the public groups, it felt like, you know, it had the collapsing energy at times. And then there's this like hurricane of like caretaking. And in my body, I just got like angry, and I just wanted to express it because that was what was most alive. But then there's a sensitivity like, oh shit, what would that do? So I just felt kind of like not there, and I couldn't participate. It did help me or communicate my truth with more sophistication. So that was great, but it's like, that takes kind of care and discernment. So I'm curious if Doug, if you could share some of the safeguards that you implemented in your circling community.
We ended up having because we run a weekly program where people have a subscription membership, and we offer like 3 to 5 opportunities for the circling process a week and other things. But we've augmented it with everyone had to come through a training program, a weekend intensive, where they got the ground rules laid out and some of the cautions and dynamics that were okay or not okay, how we would handle them. And we kind of also felt if people weren't able to actually assimilate those instructions, we gently kind of nudged them out of the process so that they didn't show up into the monthly subscription. And it may be that, you know, I'm in rural Manitoba, and there's a lot more redneck consciousness and people, you know, coming into spiritual communities that, you know, we may have to be filtering out and working with, that maybe aren't showing up in urban centers. But that's the kinds of things that we've done. And, you know, we do have very skilled facilitators. And, you know, if you know the lingo, Ali's pretty good at 4th and even 5th person perspectives and handling, you know, multi-perspectival dynamics and catching things on the fly. So we've got the skills, but there's also still the quality of circling is so much a synergistic, you know, explosion of the quality of consciousnesses in the circle, right? And so once we kind of got the basic training where people could at least hold to the structures with proper process, then the higher level circling experiences sort of emerged much more naturally, but it took a little bit of filtering. So yeah, that's what we've been struggling with, and we think we found some ways around that, but that's a whole other story.
Very cool. And Doug and his daughter Alexandra, they came to the Stoa before. They're really plugged into some cool stuff, and Alexandra and I are actually thinking of designing something at the Stoa that might address some of this stuff. So that's cool. So for our next question, maybe David Swedlow, I can tag you in. Maybe you had a thought to share, and then you had a question. If you can provide whatever feels alive.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Taylor. And it actually ties in a little bit to what Doug was just sharing and some of the challenges. The thought that I was sharing was that I think part of what attracts people, why circling spreads, is the need for connection and belonging that is unmet and often pushed out of awareness. It's kind of a suppressed feeling. And I think that the activation that happens sometimes for people with a lower tier consciousness is that internal struggle. That need comes to the surface and is trying to be suppressed at the same time. So it's really activated. And the question that I ask is really kind of along the same lines of, and my awareness, my coming into circling happened at a time just after attending a Theory U session, a 6-month program, where I recognized that my headspace processing wasn't getting to my body sensory awareness of the intelligence that wanted to come forward. So I discovered circling right at that moment where I was trying to listen to myself. And that connection need almost is a combination of listening to myself as I'm listening to the struggle of being with others as well. So I'm curious, Taylor, how if you've had a way of really making it possible for people not to try to seek circling as a fix for the brokenness of the world, but really to allow them to be willing just to be. And it can sort of, and I found in myself, it dissolves a resentment that I have of the brokenness of the world, because it's just a tenderness and innocence in myself. So I'm curious if that's something that you've also experienced or could speak to.
Mm-hmm. I think that's ultimately how we've been running events, has always been at that level. It's never sort of been like, hey, come join this new wave of stealing the culture sort of thing. I think it's always sort of been this understanding in some ways that, I'll use the word trauma, but what I really mean is sort of contractions, like energetic contractions, that they happen most often in relationship, and therefore they're best sort of healed in relationship. And it's sort of that idea, going back to that paradoxical theory of change, that if we can just fully welcome people as they are, they're even unconsciously, there's going to be shifts within them, as even for the people who struggle, who maybe have that critic, that self-critic, they start to get the reflections from the group of like, hey, like, I really like you, and oh, I really like how you did that, and oh, I noticed when you say this, I feel this, and they start to see the positive impact, or that their worst fears are never really reflected back to them. And I think this just starts, like I mentioned, it gives you this opportunity to reclaim your sovereignty and your personal agency and sort of your dignity, that has been overwritten through our implicit social programming, with how we sort of feel in day-to-day lives with relationship. So I just really think just in general, just the moves, those asanas and circling, and that real intention to feel into the landscape of another person with your whole being, not just cognitively what you think they're doing, not just your emotional impact, but also what's happening in your body. As a facilitator, I can start to mirror sort of a way of being, and I can mirror contact with my own body, such in that a way that people start to notice, like, oh, what's happening in my body, and start to bring that awareness or that wholeness. So I don't know if that necessarily answers your question, but I think that's sort of my sense on how we've approached it, how we've held it in community, but also starting to recognize too now the power of circling being put into a more purposeful context as well. So I think both are really important. I think you're right. A lot of people are drawn to it on the community and belonging side. And that's actually why at ART in the last year, we've split our events out into community events and growth events. So even though you can still get lots of community in the growth events, and you can still get a lot of growth, it's what we're prioritizing or privileging in that space. So we might privilege or do a bit more holding, a bit more feminine compassion in the community events. But in the growth events, we might start to bring in a little bit more challenge. And it's just sort of what's the attention for this space, and that sort of shifts how I'm going to react to what's happening in the circle, how I'm going to be impacted based on our shared context and our shared intention for the space.
All right, thank you, David. I'm going to sneak in one more question from Virginia on the shadow and shadow work, which you touched on earlier, Taylor.
Hi, thank you everyone. Thank you, Taylor, for this really beautiful offering. The question of shadow and groups always comes up for me. Shadow, you want to stay in the shadow. And I'm wondering how in circling, I have no experience with circling, how is shadow work done, or how does it show up in a circle? Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, I mean, the idea of shadow is it's sort of this thing that we that's part of us, but we take it and put it on the outside and sort of actually maybe even stick it behind us so we can't see it anymore. So the interesting thing about circling is that we're in this, reciprocal mutual disclosing. So we're constantly reflecting back to one another how we're showing up. So, I use that term aletheia moments, that revealing is something that had been hidden. But another term that we sort of use for it is going through the process of circling starts to reveal the water we're swimming in. So that idea that when you're in the water, you're not going to notice subtle temperature changes because it's just, you become one with the water. But you need these reflections to sort of start to highlight how you're being perceived. And while we don't specifically like, oh, there's a thing there and let's switch into a different mode and start to do work on that thing. We don't do that because, again, that's not our intention. Our intention is to be with the person in their world. And that includes with their shadow, right? I think most shadow work and circling tends to happen outside of the container of circling. And that's why I actually think community can be really important when it comes to circling, because then you have people who can take that experience and then you can do a different process with it. Then you could actually move into something if that's something that the person wanted to do. But because our intention is really not to fix anybody, our intention in circling is to just be with them as they are and see if we can appreciate them. I think Decker and Robert used this idea like the connoisseur, like notice the subtle flavors that make them uniquely them. And in many ways, people's shadow is something that makes them uniquely them. So we're not so much trying to get rid of it, but it's going to get reflected back. And I think if we start to notice something that we're getting these reflections back about the way we're showing up, and we have that cognitive dissonance, like, what, really? If you get enough of those reflections, I think a lot of people start to sort of say like, oh, what is this? And I think, for anybody who's doing circling, if you're also in therapy as well, like, wow, what a powerful combination in terms of growth that's available there, because then you can sort of bring your experience back and just say, like, hey, this thing happened, and then you can sort of dive into it. But some community also offers that. That's why a lot of communities offer one-on-one coaching. So yeah, that's what I would say about sort of how it shows up and what we do or don't really do with it in the practice.
Any brief follow-up or reflections, Virginia?
Yes, I think what I heard, and you can let me know if I heard correctly, what I heard was the circle is a space to meet what shows up. So it seemed to me, if you're kind of meeting what shows up, that there's really no place for the shadow to go. It would just be, yes, hello, kind of thing. Would that be how it would be met?
Yeah, often, for sure. Yeah. Like if it actually reveals itself rather than like, hang on a sec, something's going on here and it's not jiving with what you're saying. Sometimes that's how it can show up and we sort of like dance around it. And sometimes it can just show up and it's like, okay, there it is. Well, what's it like now that this has been revealed to you? So we can actually, again, sort of embrace it. Again, going into that paradoxical theory of change, of just like letting you be fully you accepting you as you are, warts and all. And then you're empowered, you know, you're more empowered to make the shifts that you want to. Yeah, that's a great question, Virginia. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So Taylor, we're closing, we're approaching the bottom of the hour, so let's close shortly. I just want to tag you in for any kind of closing thoughts you'd like to leave us with, any place where we can find your work and what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks everyone for coming. I wasn't so like, I knew I wanted to sort of do it, but I think there's like, I started having doubts about like, why has nobody really talked about circling in this way? There was something about that that had me started to, maybe there's a reason for it. Maybe I shouldn't do this. So I'm appreciating the reflections that I got from everybody and the questions. In terms of me, you can contact me or get involved in the community at circling.ca or authenticrelatingtoronto.com. They both take you to the same place. And we run all our events online right now due to the pandemic. We're not actually an online platform, but we'll see what happens once lockdown finishes and everybody gets vaccinated, or at least those who want it. So yeah, we run our events online. We do relating games as a drop-in event. We do Tea Group, which is that other practice that I talked about, although I didn't actually explain what it was, but it's there. And you can find out info about that on the page. And then we also do circling. So yeah, you can sign up for the newsletter there if you want to get directly involved with what we're up to. Otherwise, I hope to see a number of you on the 3rd, I think it is, when we run our practice session.
Yeah, I definitely recommend everyone check out Taylor's stuff, which I'll put on the show notes if you're watching the video. And yeah, that's what I was thinking too. I was thinking this before setting this up, but just when you're delivering it, it's like, how come no one did this before? This was so good. It's like, this is kind of needed, getting this sort of history. And you know, you totally delivered. Excellent session. Thank you so much. And thank you for coming to the story. Like, this is a true story. The last in-person session I had before the STOA started, it was with Taylor, and we did a session called Stoic Circling. We were trying to experiment with a new circling modality, which we might double click on in the future. So stay tuned for that. Taylor's coming back, as he said, on May 3rd at 6 p.m. Eastern time. There's a Patreon only event. It's going to be about 2 hours or so. So if you haven't got a taste of circling, you would like to, you can sign up there. And I'll plug in some other events that are relevant to what was spoken about today. We were talking about the shadow, and Alyssa and Aaron, kind of our shadow people at the STOA, they're having a new modality kind of introduction on shadow sense making. And I'm hoping that the STOA can be a place where like an ecology of practices can merge, and all these practices can intersect with each other. I said intersect maybe, but intersects too. We'll see what happens, practice sex. So new ones can emerge here at the STOA. And similar, one good conversational practice, verbal aikido, that I'm trying to get on people's radars. Luke Archer, the founder of it, he's coming in for 3 sessions for a mini practice session. And this is a really good conversational modality to set boundaries in the conversational space, especially with people who are having aggressive energy. That's a Patreon event. And lastly, we have another event in 30 minutes, family constellations. I don't know if you attended a family constellations thing, but I think you're one of the person that put me onto this practice. Really weird practice. One of the people from Europe who teaches it's going to come in, going to have a conversation about it. 30 minutes of the STOA. You can RSVP there. It's for free. And then there's going to be a practice session on Sunday on a Patreon event. So Taylor, everyone, thank you so much for coming to the STOA. Let's continue stealing the culture, fam, and seeing where this weird journey takes us. So thank you.